Hello. In this tutorial I'm going to look at a quick overview of how to get assets from Maya into Unreal. This is not meant to be a replacement of some of the excellent tutorials Professor Lee has provided on this same channel, where he kind of compares the Unreal to Unity workflow. If you're interested in that, take a close look at it. In this one we're going to be looking at the process as though we've already completed the Unity process as well, so I might be referencing how we did it in Unity and how to compare it to what we're doing here. This isn't comprehensive, but we will look at the basics of the process. So again, this model is the basic hallway model. All of the textures here are tile textures, very, very small, very, very lightweight, so it should be pretty easy to move from asset to asset. It also has generally pretty rough UVs, including some overlapping UVs. Unity is really tolerant of these overlapping UVs. Unreal is a little less tolerant of that, so we might see a few errors pop up as we go along. The way that I'm going to do this is by manually using the export. Here there are some file export to Unity and export to Unreal here. I'm not a big fan of these. I like to make sure that I have a little bit more direct control over what happens. So what I'm going to use is regular file export selection. Here when I export selection, it's going to ask me what file format I want to use. FBX export again is the way to do this. Now generally the settings here are fine. Making sure you have smooth mesh, any referenced assets, which we probably aren't here. I'm not worried about any animation, so that's turned off. No cameras, no lights, and no audio. But on the embed media, I'm making sure to include embed media as in the export options. This will make sure that all the textures are embedded into this single FBX file that can be unpacked by Unreal. So I will call this our hallway Unreal demo and export the file. If all goes well, then we should just see down here on the result that we've indeed exported this FBX. Now while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and export my attached light in the same way. Export selection. This will be my attached light Unreal, and the hanging light in the same way. Export selection. So that I have all of these ready to go. Now, when you launch Unreal, you'll have a dialog like this. I'm going to go ahead and launch the Unreal Engine 4.19. If you have multiple versions of Unreal installed, you can do that. This actually takes a little bit. It's going to open up the editor where we can then start working with setting a project. This is similar to Unity's project wizard that first opens up. When it opens, you can either open up old projects or work with a new project. Now, there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can work with blank, things like that. We're going to go ahead and use a first-person kind of pre-built project. This is going to have imported a bunch of the assets that we need. It actually has way more assets than we actually need, but we'll go ahead and bring them in. Down here on the bottom, you can decide where you're going to save the file. So, for instance, if I'm going to save mine here, and I'm going to give it a name, hallway Unreal demo. So this gives us our path and the name that we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and click on Create Project. Now this can take just a minute to set up. What Unreal is doing now is it's creating a new file structure, new project structure, just like we would have in Maya or Unity. And it's importing all of the basic assets it needs to allow you to do this first-person stuff. Now I'm going to resize this a little bit so I can make sure that we can see it here. When this comes in, the default thing that it opens is this demo that includes a first-person shooter. And if we press play, we can indeed run around here. It's even got a gun that attaches projectiles. We could build all this stuff in Unity. This is kind of typical of the difference between Unreal and Unity's approach to this. Unreal tends to include lots and lots of stuff that you have to kind of strip out depending on your need, where Unity you have to attach all the stuff to build up to where you're going to. In both cases, when you press play, then it goes ahead and plays the game. You hit escape to exit the play. Now this built set here is great, but we're not going to use this. We want to build a new level that we're going to bring our hallway into. So I'm going to come up to the File pull-down menu, new level. It will ask what I want to build here. In our case, since everything is inside the mountain, I'm going to just create an empty level, which means that I don't have any sky dome or any of those kinds of things. So by default, I just kind of have an empty set. Now, if you look in the interface here, one of the things that I want you to stay away from for now is this import button, where it seems like this should be the way to bring things in, but it's going to save a lot of time and effort if we just use the File, Import into Level option, because what this will do is it will import the FBX and make a new blueprint of everything that we need. It will then say, well, what do you want to import? So we'll bring in the hallway Unreal demo. Go ahead and click on Open. It's going to ask us where within our file content we want to import that stuff to. We'll come into the geometry. I'm going to right click here and call this hallway assets. Go ahead and click on OK. What this will then do is Unreal will proceed to look at that hallway FBX. It will check to see if it understands what's happening. There's a whole bunch of options here that you can play with. We're not going to have to mess with most of these. For the most case, let's just go ahead and click on Import to use the default settings. Now, this can take a little while because Unreal is unpacking, looking at the geometry, looking at the textures, creating the appropriate materials and shaders, tying everything together, and by default it sets up doing a second UV set for the light maps, whereas in Unity you have to do that manually. When it opens, you can get a few message logs that might show up. Most of the time you can ignore most of these, and so I'm going to go ahead and delete these. It also opens up this mesh editor that you can kind of see. This is kind of a preview of what all of this looks like. For what we're doing here, again, we can also just delete. So what that's done is that now inside of our scene, our default scene here, you're going to see it's called Untitled as we have this FBX hallway that we've got set up. Now, there's several ways that that Unreal works. It's a little bit different than Unity. If you'll notice here, then it sees Y as being in depth, where Unity is Z is in depth, and going up vertically, Unity sees that as Y, Unreal sees that as Z. You can still use the Alt, right, middle, and mouse click drags to work with it. It's a little bit different though. It's the reason why you'll see a lot of people in Unreal just holding the right mouse key down and then using the WAS and D to actually maneuver. It can be a much more intuitive way to think of it. You do this in Unity as well, though I tend to find that most people in Unity are using the Maya methodology to move around. Okay, so the other thing that this does is that it already has built in the first-person player, and what it uses is this class called Player Start that you can come and drag into your scene. Again, hit F to frame it, where you can decide where you want the game to begin. Now, the problem is that if I start with this set here and I go ahead and press play, it's a little hard to see what happens, but everything goes black. Now, as I hit escape, you'll see that I'm in kind of a weird place, that I've kind of been shot back into a strange place. The reason is by default, Unreal handles collisions a little bit different than you might be used to in Unity. What it does is all of its collisions, for instance, this geometry right here is seen as a solid object. What it means is that if you start inside of it, Unreal immediately ejects you out. So you're either on the outside, the bottom side, the left side, the side. You can't actually be in it. It doesn't see it as the floor and as the wall. It sees this as one solid object. So before we can do too much, we want to do a little bit of adjustment to how Unreal brought this in. To do this, come down into your content browser, change your view options. Let me resize this a little bit so you can see it. Let me resize it some more. Change your view options so that you're looking at it in columns. Once you have that in columns, then we can start to say, look, I only want to talk to the meshes. So let's organize it by type. And now I'm going to select the top mesh, scroll down, hold the shift key down and select the bottom mesh. When I have these, I'm going to right click on any of them, come down into the asset actions, and let's see, you're not going to be able to see that. Let me pull that up a little bit. So on any of these, I'll right click, come into the asset actions, and then come to, oh, you still can't see that. This capturing is going to be a little tricky. So asset actions, and then we'll come down and use bulk edit via property matrix. So again, right click on any of the static meshes we have selected, asset actions, bulk edit via property matrix. When you select that, you'll have a new editor that shows up. Here again, select from the top, and let's go ahead and shift select down to the bottom. Then over here on the side, we'll type in collisions, and we'll start to see some other things that pop up. Now, by default, Unreal brings in this level as static meshes, meaning that it thinks that those things are not going to move. This will be important for when we're baking things. But if you start to look at this area, collision complexity, what we want to do is come in and change this to use complex collisions as simple. If we select to use complex collisions as simple, and then we go ahead and close this down, then now we will be built in a way so that when I press play in the game, everything's black, but I'm actually not shot out of the level. Let's go ahead and stick a light in here so we can see how this works a little bit better. Now, over here on the left, there's built-in kind of prefabs that we can use. You know, you can bring in a sphere if you need to, or for us, we're going to come in by default and just bring a point light into the space. As I bring this point light into the space, then the properties of it will be set over here. You can see that it's got things that you would anticipate, an intensity setting, so I can adjust the intensity. It also has things like attenuation radius, which is kind of like range in Unity, if you're familiar with that. By default, this light automatically casts shadows. So very similar to the way that you would kind of think of how Unreal and Unity approach this a little bit differently. Unreal has almost everything turned on, whereas Unity has almost everything turned off. What this means is that if I drop something in there, it's automatically casting shadows different than how Unity works. So if we have this set up here, if I were to press play, then after this dramatic adjustment of how the lights work, then we should be able to see how this space is inside of the game. Now it's got all this gun stuff, which is fun but silly. Don't get distracted by that as we're trying to work through it. You'll also notice that it gives us this option or this warning that light needs to be rebuilt. Basically, it needs to be baked in the ways that we've talked about, but we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so using the strategies we've used before, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that point light there. I don't need it for now. I'm going to use File, Import into Level, and I'm going to import our attach light. I'll go ahead and put it in our hallway assets. Using the default settings will be fine. Not going to worry about those or this. And then I'm going to import into the level also our hanging light. Also into the geometry hallway assets. We'll bring that in. Go ahead and import that. All right. So once all this stuff is in, I'll be able to see it over here on the side. So for instance, here's my hanging light. So if I select that and I frame that, then I'll be able to see where that's at. Don't worry about this actor icon that's right here. For what we're going to want to do, that will be fine. Now, what I'm going to do though is I want to make sure that I'm looking carefully at this particular asset. I'm going to come in here, and while it's here, will of course use some of the other options. So I'm going to come into the lights, use a spotlight, bring that spotlight, get it kind of into position, and go ahead and kind of tuck it up into there. If I start to look at this lit, let's make sure that's actually set down there a little bit. Then we can start to see how this would look in the scene. Now it's not baked or anything, so we have to be kind of aware of how that might be a little bit different. And I'm probably going to find that if I group these together, that I want to be able to take all of this and slide it up just a little bit. so that it's not quite so low in our space. But now as I start to look at this being lit, I can start to see how this might start to work. Now again, with that spotlight, I can come in and do everything from changing an inner outer core intensity, even the light color. So maybe I want to give this a little bit of a yellow light to it that we see there. You can see that all of the same things that you would expect to see in these lights are all available in this area. Okay, so one thing that's a little bit different about how this works if we want to start copying and pasting this into space is that when you start to, even though this is a child, if I take this this object right here and copy and paste it, Control C, Control V, it doesn't take the children with it. So you want to make sure that you take both of these. The keyboard shortcut for duplicate in Unity is actually Control W, but when you hit Control W, then you can see that that we can get that other information there. So let's look at this unlit for just a second, and let's take all of this stuff here, and let's actually pull it over into another chunk of our scene that will be a little bit easier to work with. So I'm going to pull all this stuff over here, similar to what we had set up actually in Unity down this hallway, just so you can compare apples to apples. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get that set up. I'm going to again select both of these, Control W. Let's slide that over. Control W. Control W will slide that duplicate over. Control W will slide that duplicate over. We're not going to worry too much about getting this exactly right, but we just want to get some of those into that space so that when we look at this lit, we can start to see how that's outputting. Now it doesn't look like I'm in the middle of the hallway, so I might take a second here to grab all this stuff and actually adjust it over so that it might be in a little bit better place for what I'm after. Okay, so if we were to go ahead and play, notice this hasn't been built yet, but if I were to go ahead and play in the scene, then I should be able to walk over here and start to look at how that space actually works. Now, again, escape to get out of there. We want to make sure that I start to build this lighting setup because currently our lighting setup doesn't have any bounce light, so it's really dark in this space. So what I'm going to do is, with my lighting set up here, I'm going to come up to the build options here and tell it to build lighting only. What this will do is it'll start to bake all of our lighting down, make sure that we can get a little bit more sophisticated output. You can't see it, but down on the bottom right corner of my screen, you're going to see this some dialogue that's showing that it's actually building the lighting. When it's done, you'll start to see it building the rest of the lighting and baking those textures as needed into the scene. All right, finally, when it's complete, you'll see this message log. Let's not worry about these. These will be fine for what we're doing here. But you'll see that the output is much more sophisticated. You can see that we can actually see a lot of the bounce light and how that works. I'm going to come up and let's go ahead and grab our controller here, our player start. And I'm going to move player start into this hallway just so we can see this a little bit better. So now when I press play, after we light up, then we should be able to see how our output is working here. So here's the basics of what's happening. Now, some of the things I still don't like is, for instance, even though the light source is coming from there, that's not illuminated, which doesn't look good. To do that, we need to make a few adjustments to how the texture works. So let's look at how we would adjust that. So in order to get that right, what we need to do is come in and adjust the materials that are already built there. Now we've already built the materials in for this in Maya, as we saw in the Unity tutorial. If I select that FBX, that actor here, then as you look down on the side here, we'll be able to start to select, for instance, in this case, that hanging light. So we'll see the static mesh that it's created. We'll also see the two materials that are attached to it. One is the kind of green blue material here, and the other is the material on the inside that is meant to glow. If you double click on that, it will open up the material editor that allows us to work with this. Now this is a super nice method of working, very similar to the hypergraph or hypershade in Maya. We can do things like change, basic colors of things if we need to, if we choose to. And we can also do things like, I'm going to take this node, copy and paste it, so I've got another node, and use its out and connect that to the emissive color. So what it'll do now is that now not only is this material have a base color, but it also has an emissive setting as well. The settings for almost any of these you can also see over here on the left side as you select them. But it becomes a really easy way to kind of start to work with this. So making sure that this material is emissive, when you try and close it, it says, hey, do you want me to save it? Yes, we want you to save it. It will make those changes, and then we will see them illuminated in the space. This starts to make this much more believable. Again, it's already got default glow on it, so that it's just like a post-rendering stack in Unity. We can start to see and believe that lighting much more, becomes much more believable.